How did the world's biggest superpower lose a war to a much, much smaller country? I mean, it's a question that's really hung over America for decades. And the simple answers, the ones you've probably heard a bunch of times, well, they don't really tell the whole story. So we're going to dig into what really happened.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? Why did America lose? And on the surface, it seems like it should have a simple answer, but it's anything but. It's this incredible story full of secret presidential strategies, a clash between two totally different ways of thinking about war, and, believe it or not, a single TV broadcast that kind of changed everything.
You know, the most common story you'll hear is this idea that's often called the stab in the back myth. The argument goes something like this. The military was winning, absolutely winning on the battlefield, but they got betrayed. Betrayed by politicians back in D.C., a hostile media, and all the anti-war protesters. But is it really that simple?
Okay, so let's start right there. Was this really a war that was lost back home? Because this idea, man, it's been so powerful. It's really shaped how entire generations of Americans remember the whole conflict.
And look, the narrative is super compelling, right? You've got this brave military effort, and it gets undermined by a lack of support back home. And don't get me wrong, public opinion, the media, all of that was absolutely crucial. But it is not the whole story. Not even close. To get to the real truth, we've got to pull back the curtain on what was happening at the very top in presidential politics.
And when we pull back that curtain, what we find is something that a lot of people don't know about, but it is absolutely critical to understanding the whole thing. It was a secret strategy called the decent interval.
So out in the open, in front of the cameras, the Nixon administration's message was totally clear. They were working on peace with honor. You heard that phrase all the time. The idea was to get a deal that would guarantee a stable, independent, and non-communist South Vietnam. That was the promise they sold to everyone.
But behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. And we know this because of declassified tapes. You can actually hear National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger telling President Nixon that the timing of the U.S. pullout was really all about one thing: getting reelected in 1972. The goal wasn't some lasting peace, it was just getting past Election Day.
So let's just be really clear about this. The actual strategy was to create a decent interval. Top officials, we're talking Kissinger, Nixon, they knew, and they said it to each other in private, that South Vietnam probably wasn't going to make it on its own. The whole plan was just to create enough of a time gap between when the U.S. left and when South Vietnam fell so that their administration wouldn't get the blame. And that, well, that just blows up the whole idea that the war was winnable at that point.
But that high-level politics stuff, that's only part of the story. The loss was also baked into a fundamental mismatch on the ground. You had two sides that weren't just fighting each other in the same country, they were fighting two completely fundamentally different kinds of war.
Think of it like they were playing by two totally different rule books. The U.S. was all about its traditional way of battle. That means overwhelming firepower, technology, and the goal is just to annihilate enemy forces. It's a classic military-first approach. But Hanoi, their strategy was called Dao Trang, and it was everything all at once. It combined the military, the political, the diplomatic, all of it was aimed at one single target. And that target wasn't the American army. It was American political will back home.
So what exactly is this Dao Trang thing? Well, the word itself just means struggle. But it's way more than just fighting. It's this all-encompassing idea where every single action, a small guerrilla attack, a move at the negotiating table, even a propaganda broadcast, it's all designed to work in concert, to slowly and methodically wear down the enemy's mind and their will to fight over a very, very long time.
You know who summed it up best? Henry Kissinger himself, years later. He said, "We fought a military war. Our opponents fought a political one. The U.S. was trying to win by racking up a body count, physical attrition. But North Vietnam was playing the long game, aiming for our psychological exhaustion. And in a long, drawn-out war, the side with the stronger will, well, they can often outlast the side with the stronger military."
And this total clash of strategies really exploded onto the world stage in 1968, with the single most famous event of the war, the Tet Offensive. And honestly, it's one of the biggest, most mind-bending paradoxes in all of military history.
Okay, so let's get one thing straight, right up front. From a purely military, boots-on-the-ground perspective, the Tet Offensive was an absolute catastrophe for the Communists. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they were just hammered. They took devastating losses and didn't hold a single one of their military objectives. On the battlefield, it was a huge win for the U.S. and South Vietnam. Period.
But remember, the war wasn't just being fought in the jungles.
It was also being fought every night on the evening news in American living rooms. And this guy right here, Walter Cronkite, the anchor for CBS News, literally called the most trusted man in America, he decided to fly over to Vietnam and see what was really going on for himself after Tet.
And when he came back, he did something almost unheard of. He went on the evening news and delivered his own personal editorial. He didn't say America was losing the war, but he said we weren't winning it either. His conclusion? That America was mired in stalemate. And that single word, stalemate, was an absolute bombshell. It flew directly in the face of all the optimistic reports coming out of Washington.
The effect was just immediate. It was huge. President Lyndon Johnson was watching, and he famously said something like, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He knew, in that moment, that if the voice of mainstream American trust no longer believed we could win, then the political will to keep fighting was basically gone.
And that is the great paradox of the Tet Offensive. A massive, clear-cut military victory for the U.S. somehow became the exact moment of its decisive political and psychological defeat. It ripped open this huge credibility gap between what the government was saying and what people were seeing on their TVs, and it just shattered American optimism about the war pretty much for good.
All right, so let's fast forward a bit. After the U.S. finally pulls out its combat troops in 1973, the whole war is now in the hands of the South Vietnamese Army, also known as the ARVN. And here's the key. They had been built up, trained, and equipped by the Americans to fight a modern American-style war. But now, they were going to have to fight that war all by themselves, and the American support they completely depended on, it was about to vanish.
Back in Washington, Congress starts slashing aid to South Vietnam, and the effect on the South Vietnamese army was, well, it was catastrophic. It's wild. Even the North Vietnamese commander estimated that the RVN's firepower dropped by a staggering 60%. And their mobility, their ability to use helicopters and tanks, got cut in half. They were being hollowed out.
And to put that into perspective, just think about this. By 1975, some of their artillery units were down to just 6 shells per cannon per day. 6! I mean, you just can't fight a modern war like that. They had all this fancy American equipment, but the plug had been pulled on the supplies needed to actually use it. So when that final collapse came in 1975, it was because of a whole bunch of things hitting at once. Their supply lines were totally broken. The promised American air support that was supposed to stop a big offensive, it never showed up. And as the North Vietnamese army rolled south, South Vietnamese soldiers who were mostly just local guys started melting away from their units to go try and save their own families. It was a complete, perfect storm of military and moral collapse.
There's this story that gets told a lot, and even if it's not literally true, it perfectly captures the whole war. The story goes that after it's all over, an American colonel is talking to his North Vietnamese counterpart, and he says, "You never once beat us on the battlefield." And the Vietnamese officer just replies, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant."
Because in the end, the Vietnam War wasn't lost by the soldiers in the field. It was lost by strategists and politicians in Washington who just fundamentally misunderstood the kind of war they were in. And that leaves us with a really big question for today, doesn't it? In our current world of hybrid warfare, disinformation, and all these gray zone conflicts, has America really learned the central lesson of Vietnam? The lesson that you can win every single battle and still lose the war?